Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Kopitiam Council. It's been a while since we recorded an episode, mostly because we are waiting for this perfect opportunity to release this episode. And this episode is tackling an important holiday, a holiday which maybe some people might feel is underrated or not really looked much into compared to the other fantastic holidays that we have in Malaysia. And that is on the 16th of September 1963, Malaysia was formed. So for a lot of people that still get in their head that Merdeka was the day Malaysia was formed. Sorry to say, that was the day Malaya was formed. Malaysia was formed on 16 September 1963. So that is almost 61 years ago. A lot of things have happened. Can we say that Malaysia really is the Malaysia that was aspired, what the founding fathers at the time thought was the Malaysia they wanted to be? So, with that, we have a guest today to unravel a bit of the historical context behind the formation of Malaysia. And he is a recurring figure over here at Kopitiam Council. We've already had him before on an episode a few months back. We are honored to have Mr. Avtar Singh once again. And if any of you are interested in more of Avtar, he is also a content creator over at YouTube under the channel name Avtar Singh History, where he delves a lot into Sabahan history and Malaysian history. Sometimes he picks at the more granular behind the scenes details of a lot of intrigue sprinkled within. So if you all like that kind of stuff, like more Game of Thrones kind of plot twists and all that, so Avtar's channel is the perfect place for you. So Avtar, we're glad to have you back on Kopitiam Council.
Thanks for having me.
So I think we can just get straight into it after. So the journey to Malaysia's formation involved complex negotiations and a lot of regional aspirations. So given the political climate of the early 1960s, what were the key motivations, based on your research, for Sabah's leaders to join the Malaysian Federation? And how did their perspective shape the final agreements? Did they have a lot of say in it? Did they kind of just bend to the wind? Or and in hindsight, do these motivations still resonate with the current political landscape in Sabah?
My sort of understanding of how complicated it was, and it was very complicated. I think we sometimes tend to take it for granted that we simply sat in a room and signed an agreement and that was it. And it was not. It was far more complicated. And over time, as we've discovered, um, perspectives change, people's opinions change, and people's views of what did we want. In 1956, 1957, we knew by then that something was going to happen. It was just a question of what was going to happen, what sort of makeup would it be. As far back as 1953, we were Sabah, North Borneo and Sarawak and Brunei had already been meeting in Kuching, discussing on the possibilities of a formation of sort of a Borneo territories of three coming together to form one. And of course, they carried on to 1957. It didn't really go anywhere. Brunei was hesitant. Sarawak was sort of unsure. Well, what can we bring to the table? And Sabah, we were going through a very interesting period, I would say, but we were still novices as far as trying to understand how to play this political game. We had no political parties before the end of the 1960s. We had no politicians. Very few Sabahans were educated at a university level or in public policy or public administration. It was mainly the colonial officers that were in charge and running the show. And that was the great fear. At that time. We didn't have the manpower. We didn't have the administrators. We didn't have Sabahans that were trained in public policy, public administration. We didn't have political parties. We didn't have politicians. So we were in a very strange place at that time, unlike many other countries that were seeking independence, such as Singapore, for example. They had political parties. They had elections. We didn't have that. So I think if you look at Tun Mustafa's point of view and Donald Stevens' point of view on the future of North Borneo when you get into sort of 1961, 1962. The perspectives are very different. You know, the Tunku Abdul Rahman makes a very famous speech in Singapore, sort of May 61, where he sort of suggests, hey, why don't the Borneo territories form this new nation we may call Malaysia with Singapore and Malaya? And it catches everybody off guard. The British are aware of the negotiation. They're aware of this idea, but they didn't expect Tunku Abdul Rahman to change his mind. He had been against it prior to that. But I think common sense sort of prevailed with the communist problem in Singapore. So he suggested it. Sabah, it appears North Borneo and Sarawak were caught off guard. We didn't expect it. Donald Stevens reacted to it. He was very unhappy that North Borneo community leaders, I use the word community leaders because they were not politicians. We didn't have political parties. Leaders of various communities were not consulted before Tunku Abdul Rahman made that speech. Tun Mustafa was very open to the idea. He was supportive of the idea. He liked the idea. And Donald Stevens changes his perspective from being very upset to, well, maybe we'll think about it 2 months down the road. And a year later, political parties have been formed. We were negotiating and we were moving forward with this plan. And we were rushing to meet a deadline. When we got into late 62, into 1963, we were rushing to meet the 31st August deadline to form Malaysia. So to answer your question, people's opinions change. I think the one person in the end, even when we got to 31st August, who was still adamant it was not a good idea, it was a really horrible idea, and we really should think about this, but I'll go ahead and support the idea at this moment. It's probably Sundang. He was really the only one. Everybody else had sort of given up on sort of opposing the idea. So.
Yeah, Aftar, you mentioned a little bit about how Tunku Abdul Rahman changed his mind and whatnot.
Yeah.
How would at that time, community leader would react to this, especially on because this whole Malaysia formation hinge on Tunku Abdul Rahman himself. So he's the so-called the man that would make it true or not. So at the time, Tun Stephen would just say, it's Tunku Abdul Rahman's decision to do so. So what would be decision then?
Well, the thing is, it's Singapore that really pushes for it. Lee Kuan Yew really pushes for this idea and concept of this. The Borneo territories, it would appear, are not a part of the greater scheme of merger. It's just Lee Kuan Yew is adamant it's the only way to protect the Singapore economy going forward. He admits this. He's actually given speeches about this, which are recorded, on why he is pushing for merger. He makes public announcements on the radio in Singapore. Look, this is what we need to do. This is the future. If we don't do this, we risk having an economic war with Malaya when they complete their airport in Subang, when they finish their port in Port Klang and it becomes a direct competitor to Singapore. They may not need Singapore anymore as an export center. After that point in time, Singapore was a very important center of export and import for Malaya. And by that period of time, Malaya was sort of making their own plans. So I think he foresaw the problem economically that, look, at the end of the day, the only way forward is to have some sort of partnership or some sort of relationship with Malaya. Tunku Abdul Rahman obviously was against it at that time because it didn't make sense. And there was a serious communist threat in Singapore. The Singapore government, People's Action Party, which is the political party that Lee Kuan Yew represented, were facing the threat, and it was a real threat, of being overthrown in the elections that were to come. And the danger of the Communist Party actually coming into power was real. And Tunku Abdul Rahman seemed to realize that. If you read his autobiographies, and there are quite a few, he talks about this real threat and emphasizes, look, this cannot happen. And he actually does say this in his final autobiography before he did pass away, is that, look, if by hook or by crook, if ever the Communist Party, and he hints at this, if ever the Communist Party ever came into power, we would have to do something. We would have to react. So they did take it very seriously at the time. Borneo comes along because of, I think Tunku had to try and convince members of the political party, including MCA, MIC, and also senior members in UMNO, that look, this is the only rational way we can work and get this formation with Singapore. If we are to go ahead with it, is to find some sort of equilibrium balance, population-wise, and that is to invite the Borneo territories to be a part of this new nation that we're building, and to have balance in the number of Bumiputras and indigenous peoples and the number of Chinese and other races. So we need to have them involved. So that's sort of how we came about, to my understanding.
Yeah, just a follow up, considering the context at the time, Avtar, because you mentioned Tunku had to somewhat convince the upper leadership in
Yeah.
UMNO. What was the sentiment with the people in UMNO itself, or even all the leaders in Malaya when they were told that, okay, Borneo is up on the tables here to be brought into a merger? What was the consensus? Was Tunku mostly alone on this, or did he have enough influence enough to get the leadership to say that, okay, this may be a good idea? What was the reaction?
Well, the reaction within UMNO was not a popular one as far as when it was discussed. Now, I've not seen documents. I must state, I've not seen documents from within UMNO as to what the general feeling and consensus was in the lead up to, let's say, 1961, because I'm sure this had been discussed before 1961 or in the early months of 1961, before he goes to Singapore and delivers this speech to the media, and that catches everybody by surprise. So if we go back to his autobiographies, and again, there's several books that he's written about what transpired and so forth, it would appear that the majority were against it, and they just said, look, it doesn't make rational sense. There will be a shift in the number of voters from certain segments, certain racial groups, and that was not something they were comfortable with. But when the idea of the Borneo territories being involved in this, then I think there was a softening of opinions. Okay, this maybe can work. I think the one folly in this that Tunku sort of makes is that when it refers to the peoples of the indigenous peoples and the Bumiputras of the Borneo territories, they're just like us. And I think there was probably I think there's sort of a little bit of a misunderstanding. He didn't really understand people's views in the Borneo territories, how they viewed the world and how they view many things. So, but it is what it is. And that's how we ended up where we are today. So.
Right. Sabah's history before the formation of Malaysia includes periods of Bruneian influence and British colonial, as we know. But it lacked the cohesive political structures in place, like Sarawak was under the Brooks.
Yeah.
How did this historical context, particularly the tribal and loosely governed nature of pre-colonial Sabah, contributed to the perception of Sabah as a recent construct when it was integrated into Malaysia? And how does it, historical background influence our understanding of Sabah statehood as we know for it today?
I think there's, again, another misconception that any system of administration in North Borneo only began in 1881 when the chartered company sort of established itself, then eventually it got its royal charter. We know historically that the coastlines, I've got to be a bit careful here, not to say all of Sabah, the coastlines of Sabah had already an established system of administration. The Bruneians had introduced it. Now, there's two narratives to this because we simply don't know. Number one, this system of administration along all the rivers and the coastlines of Sabah, that means all on the west coast to the north and to the east coast, whether the Bruneians actually introduced it, inspired by other kingdoms and other empires. And we sort of have a period, sort of the 16th century, when it gets introduced, right? So it actually is a system of administration. It's not a matter of just putting one person there and telling them collect taxes for me and send it back to us. They actually establish an actual proper system of administration, and they have administrators that are overseeing this. territories are divided into Sabah, and ownership is given over certain territories to different members of the royal family and also members of the royal house, the different temenggons and so forth. And they are passed down from generation to generation. So a system of administration, as well as claims of ownership and territories, had pre-existed the arrival of the British. If we go back to the 16th century by at least 300 years or so. Now, the second narrative is that this system was introduced by the Majapahit through the Bruneians. So the Majapahit had basically said, okay, this is what we want you to do. You need to pay royalty or tribute payments to us yearly. We're not going to go to war, but you will pay tribute to us, and you will establish this sort of system of administration to collect taxes from the rivers. The rivers are a lifeline as far as Sabah is concerned. Trade goes down rivers. Movement down rivers as well, people's coming down to barter trade and trade for products and stuff. Trade had pre-existed. We know trade had pre-existed for at least 2,000 years, going back to the first century, and probably beyond that, before that. So anyways, I'm not talking about trade tonight, but the rivers become absolutely essential to the wealth of Brunei that grew, the wealth of the Brunei Sultanate. And another thing to point out is we see a very similar system on the west coast of Malaya before and during the establishment of the Malacca Sultanate. So we may have got inspiration from somewhere else. That was sort of the narrative I was saying. It could be Brunei established it, Majapahit established it, but a similar system did exist on the west coast of Malaya, Peninsula Malaya, pre-Malacca or during the Malacca Sultanate period.
Yeah, so after in that vein, right? Since you mentioned the coastal communities, so the hinterland in basically the interior part of Sabah, would you say that it was just being more so administered in a way to extract tribute, and they were left alone?
Okay, so I just realized I didn't answer the entire question earlier because we also have to talk about Sarawak and Sabah a little bit. So I'll get to your question, Adi. The Sarawak situation and the Sabah situation are vastly different. I would say that when, say for example, Raja James Brooke comes to Brunei to acquire Sarawak, the Sarawak he attains is a very complicated Sarawak. So many tribal wars, so many different ethnic groups, so many rivers, far more rivers than we have in Sabah. And it's incredibly difficult for him to establish rule there. It takes him a long time to get everybody to submit to what he wants and how the system of administration he wants in Sarawak. Very different to Sabah. By the time the chartered company comes in, there really is not so much opposition the way Sarawak had when Brooke went in, 40-something years before. So it's very different in that sense. Now, as far as the hinterland is concerned, to answer Adi's question, what was the question, Adi? Sorry.
Because you mentioned that a lot of this administration, cultivation of administrative system was more on the coastal areas, right?
Yes.
So I was wondering, what about the hinterlands? Was it more of a system of just extracting tribute, and then just leaving the local population alone, or was there more? Was it more involved?
Okay, so we're talking about hinterland. We're talking about the interior. Is that correct?
Yeah, in the interior.
Yeah. So far, I've not seen any evidence, and I've not heard of any evidence from other historians that the Bruneians, for example, ventured beyond the coastlines. They didn't really venture into the interior of Sabah, into the highlands. Okay, so that's sort of the narrative I've gone along with because there's no evidence, not seen evidence. I've only ever seen one instance where there is a relationship between a community in what is today modern-day Telupit, and if you follow the river downstream, you'll come out somewhere near Baluran, and it carries on up to Labuk Bay. So there was one community, sort of the early 1800s, that actually did submit to the Sultanate of Sulu, and they did establish ties with the Sultanate of Sulu, and they did pay tribute to the Sultanate of Sulu. So that was one example, but it was relatively late. But otherwise, in the interior, we don't believe that Brunei had influence in the interior. It was various communities, various warlords doing as they pleased, and yeah, I've not seen evidence that the Bruneians had any control. The only source of income as far as taxation would be downriver, downstream, when they came down to barter trade for jungle products and barter trade for vital essential products that they needed, and they brought back to their communities in the interior.
After in your recent, I think few recent video in your
Yep.
YouTube channel, you there's a title of video called "Land of Migration."
Yes.
Right, and in there you mentioned that Sabah is land of migration. Where do these people from the Philippines or whatever to escape? It could be one of them is Sabah because it's just next door.
Yeah.
If that's the case, yeah, I'm just trying to find some logic here. If that's the case, like how and why within Sabah itself, people in the hinterland, like Adi mentioned, and the coastline are not really integrated to like a seamless community. If Sabah is a land of migration, yes, I'm sure you probably referring to the coastline in the near modern day Sandakan and Lahadatu. What you mentioning in Kudat as well. But why is it so hard? I mean, I understand the geography of it's very hard. It's but we know this salt trail that from people in Penampang all the way walk to the Tenom area. So I'm sure there's a relationship, isn't it?
Well, I'll give you an example. By the time you get to sort of the early 1900s, we know that, for example, Dusun men in the Kota Belud district, what is now the Kota Belud district, Dusun men could speak Malay. And they would be the ones that would negotiate when they went down to Kota Belud or areas along the Kedaiman, what is the Kedaiman River today, to barter trade and exchange products. We know that Dusun women couldn't speak Malay. So that's quite interesting. Owen Rutter writes about this, and I think Evans as well talks about this as well. So I thought that was very fascinating. So the ability to speak Malay. I mean, a Dusun would have to learn a language, a new language, in order to communicate and stuff. So that was fascinating. So we don't know, because we simply don't know the ability and the communication between the indigenous peoples in the interior, what their relationship was with coastal tribes. There's simply not very much that we have any to work with. Whatever has been written, whatever is known, is only come about probably in the late 1800s, when certain Europeans start going into the interior to look at different communities, how they live and so forth. But what we do see is that there seems to be an ability to accept somebody else coming in, let's say from Kudat going into Pitas or Paitan, a Malay, let's say a Bajau or somebody from Iranun or so forth, who's a guide leading Europeans into the interior. And they're able to transfer, they're able to get inside there without any problem. So if we also able to go into communities in the interior without being attacked or without there being any sort of issues, and they're able to then communicate as well, there is the ability to speak Malay. So by the late 1800s, it would appear that trade is ongoing. There has been intermarriage is something we don't really talk about as well. There is a lot of intermarriage that has gone on, is going on, even if we get to the mid 1800s and late 1800s, between various communities, when they come and establish themselves, regardless if it's the west coast or the east coast, or even in Marudu to the north, or even down south, all the way down in Spitang, intermarriage becomes very common. And that could be a reason why communities are able to sort of cooperate and also communicate in trade. And to answer your question, as far as the East Coast is concerned, why is there, there is possibly, you could possibly say, yes, why are they not able to sort of integrate the way the West Coast did, right? So the Iranon families are intermarrying with Bajau families, and they are intermarrying with Dusuns, and so forth and so forth and so forth. It becomes a norm. But on the East Coast, it's a little bit. You have to bear in mind the population, and we're looking at the population census by the late 1800s. You compare the East Coast and the West Coast populations, and they are incredibly unbalanced. There's significantly less peoples on the East Coast, and we assume it's down to raids and piracy and kidnappings and so forth. There's a very active slave trading center on the island of Tawi Tawi, which is just very near to the coastlines of east coast of Sabah, and several islands in the Sulu Sultanate as well. Is this the reason why there's a population imbalance? Maybe. But there are, for example, Balanginggi and Sulu communities that start getting established on the East Coast. They are trading with people in the interior. We know that in the late 1800s, there is trade that is established. So we must assume that they are able to communicate. Why did they not go into the interior? Okay, that's probably another interesting question. Why did they not venture further in? We're talking about headhunting tribes that just don't want outsiders coming and threatening their way of life. And they see the world very differently. They were not people of religion. They were people who believed in a very different world from everybody else.
Yeah, just when we're asking all this, it's mostly we can conclude it in the way Sabah pre-formation was quite administered in a way that, in a way, you can say a laissez-faire in the system, even if when the British was around after. So in this kind of context, right, when we go back to the idea of statehood, the idea of Sabah, would you say that this is more of a recent construct, or would you say it's been floating around Sabahan people way before? Because I remember when Danny Wong's research, he did come up with some petitions from people from Mbakut saying that they already called it Negeri Sabah, but they also called Mbakut Negeri as well. So where did this idea of Sabah come along within this kind of context?
I could not give you an answer to this question. It's a complicated question. I know various kingdoms pre-existed, even during the time of the Bruneians. Then they looked upon themselves as their own domain. And when we get further down, Professor Danny Wong, I think, is absolutely spot on. And I would not disagree with him. I would not even attempt to disagree with him. And calling for independence for Sabah, it may very well have been the case. Unfortunately, I've not seen enough material to comment on that particular question. So I apologize.
All right, no worries. Then I guess we can move on a bit
Sure.
down the line. Now we already have Malaysia established, right?
Yeah.
And this is related to some of the talks you've done on Syed Kachik, because Syed Kachik is a name that is not really a household for, let's say, newer generations. Of course, he was a name quite prominent back then. So you've talked about his role and his prominence in influencing Sabah's trajectory throughout the late 1960s until the mid 1970s. So what can you elaborate on this, in a way, enigmatic figure? And this is more just to explain to young viewers, like younger people here that are listening, who is Syed Kachik and why was he so important after the formation?
Syed Kachik is a character that his name, I'd heard it when I was a very young boy. When I was born during the Mustafa years. We call it the Mustafa Syed Kachik years. So I had heard his name quite a bit growing up, and it was not a name that was spoken of with great admiration. Unfortunately, it's not spoken with any great happiness. But let's go back to the beginning. Syed Kachik is a intelligent, driven lawyer who ventures into politics because his friend Datuk Seno is a minister in the Malaysian federal government. He is a problem solver, and that's really the word I would use for somebody like Syed Kachik. He's a problem solver. They send him and use him where they need him to deal with situations. So early on, he's involved with elections in Kedah. He helps UMNO to win the elections there. And eventually, Tun Mustafa, who is by then he has aspirations to be chief minister at sort of 1965, when the relationship between him and Donald Stevens had deteriorated significantly. And I think it comes down to the fact that Mustafa and Donald Stevens had been very close in the years leading up to formation of Malaysia. And once the relationship deteriorated, Mustafa didn't feel he had anybody that he could really turn to for good political advice and legal advice. So he asks Tunku Abdul Rahman, is there somebody that you can send to help guide me and to help me solve the problems that I'm facing with certain political parties that are causing problems? Syed Kachik is sent, and what he brings, he changes the entire dynamic of politics in Sabah for a number of reasons. His style of politics is significantly different from how the other political parties, and they're on the same alliance, the Sabah Alliance. By this time, you have UPCO, which is led by Donald Stevens. You have USNO, that's led by Tun Mustafa, and they are no longer on friendly terms. The relationship has deteriorated. Syed Kachik helps UMNO to win the elections. Tun Mustafa becomes chief minister. And he, for the most part, essentially becomes sort of the de facto number 2 in USNO and also in Sabah politics. Now, what tends to upset a lot of Sabahans when we talk about Syed Kachik, it's generally 3 things. Firstly, he comes up with a really bright idea and a very smart idea with, it would appear, good intentions. How do we fund education for Sabahans? We don't have any universities. We need to send many of our young youth to other places for an education, but how do we fund it? So they come up with this interesting idea. Well, we'll establish this foundation. This foundation will fund itself through the harvesting of timber. We will allocate a certain amount of land in Sabah to this foundation. They will do as they please to raise revenue, and we will send our youth for further education. So the intentions are good. But what goes wrong with this is that it is a foundation that is not under the purview of the state legislative, the state assembly. So basically, they have the powers to do as they please. And the second thing that really upsets a lot of people, and I think it's just that Syed Kachik saw opportunities. Like most people in life, when you are presented with opportunities, you have 2 options. One, take the opportunity and get what you want, what you need. Or 2, don't do anything and walk away or look the other way. So he chose to take the opportunities, and he acquired mass amounts of native title lands, relatively cheap, CL lands, I mean commercial lands, relatively cheap, and also some government lands, all in favor of a company he established. Now, the thing that upset people the most about all this was the fact that he'd acquired so much of land. But the thing is, we tend to sort of ignore the fact that he had vision. And I bring up this word vision because none of our leaders at that time had that same vision that he had. I would have to admit this. He foresaw a lot of potential for Sabah as a tourism destination, and that Sabah needed to have far more development than it had occurred up to 1965. So Yayasan Sabah was one step. Second step was to acquire land and to build this new Kota Kinabalu city in what is today sort of the One Borneo Indah Permai, is it Indah Permai or Kingfisher area, which the state government had to buy the land from him at a vast profit for him. The thing that upset a lot of Sabahans was that he acquired permanent residency relatively fast, which, okay, that's under the purview of the chief minister. It's his choice, and everything was done legally. So the thing that was that he also then went one step forward and acquired and applied for native title status. And this really upset a lot of Sabahans, because everybody knows he's not a Sabahan, he's not born in Sabah, and so forth. But again, everything was done legally. He was given native title status legally. He argued his case after Osno were removed from office in 1976. He actually went to court before the federal government and before Sabah government had any chance to take action against him. He fought in court and he won his case, where he argued, look, I've been living here he made a very fair argument. And so when a new administration had taken over Yayasan Sabah in 1976, when they did a full audit, a forensic audit, as we use the word today, forensic audit, and went through the books and so forth, they didn't find anything that was abnormal. He had done whatever he had done, whether we agree with it or not, seemed to have been done above board and within the context of his position as the foundation director. So it was very hard to sort of go after him in that sense. So when I use the word driven, intelligent, smart, very smart guy, but the trouble is the brand of politics that he introduced to Sabah changed the future of Sabah, because we, for the first time in Malaysian politics, had politicians that were willing to jump ship and join the opposition. I won't use the words incentives or encouraged. I would just say that they made a decision to jump ship. APCO lost two of its politicians that won their seats. They jumped ship and joined USNO. And this really tipped the balance. But this was Syed Kachik at work, behind the scenes. So this phenomenon has carried on until recent times. It's become a norm, so yeah. So that's his legacy. He eventually had to leave. I know he left very frustrated with Tan Sri Haris Saleh, and their relationship wasn't good. Tan Sri Haris had a number of lawsuits and so forth with the family of Syed Kachik. But in the end, the legacy is that we had to buy a lot of land that actually was Sabahan land back from him at a massive profit, and that was one of the legacies that I think people are still, even till today, very sore about.
All right. While we are within this period of time, like in 60s, 70s, 80s, up to 90s, what sort of the thinking or the mindset at that time after the formation of Malaysia, especially because you mentioned there was no politicians prior to the formation of Malaysia. It's just community leaders, as you say, and then leading up to where UMNO officially entered Sabah. Within this period, before UMNO come in, what was it like to, if you want to describe the political scenes in Sabah, which is, as you mentioned already, like USNO was there, Putrajaya, I think also was there, PBS already set up. So we do have these local political parties, but some sort of if I want to use the analogy in my questions before, there was no synchronizations between people in the Keningau or Tenom area and people living near to the coastlines. So USNO would represent that, right? PBS would represented by the people in what we call today Keningau sort of area. So why is this happening? And maybe you can answer first the within that period before UMNO entered Sabah, and how was the political scene at that time?
I think one of the biggest tragedies in Sabah politics, actually Dato' Joe Samad mentioned this a couple of months ago, and I'd actually already sort of thought about it, the legacy of the British. And I don't blame this on the British administration in North Borneo. I blame it on decisions made in London. The replication of introducing political parties by race and religion versus the British system of administration of Labour Party and the Conservative Party, where you actually stand for elections or you join a political party based on political beliefs, political philosophies. And I thought that was probably one of the greatest tragedies in Sabah politics, because it really starts with this decision, and all they're doing is just merely copying what had happened in Malaya, for example. And Singapore doesn't have it. Singapore is PAP. It's they've got their own philosophy and so forth. Some have argued it's a socialist party, and they're going up against a communist party. They're not really any different, but yeah, there is a difference philosophically. And I think the problems all start there, and you just go forward, and we have never had stability because of this. The sad thing is that one group thinks that they have the right to rule over Sabah. And then another group comes along and says, hang on a minute, maybe we also have a right to sort of, why is it just you? What about us? And it just keeps repeating itself going forward. And what you have is eventually USNO loses favor. So Donald Stevens loses favor with Tunku Abdul Rahman. USNO comes into power. There's no opposition by the time you get to the end of the 1960s, because the emergency has been declared. There's no opposition. UPCO has been dissolved. There's no real opposition. Everybody in the Sabah Alliance is all aligned with USNO. There are a couple of independent politicians, and they all end up in jail for 2 years. So again, no opposition. So we go through this period from 1967 until 1976, where it's really one party rule, and it's two people actually ruling the whole of Sabah. Berjaya is actually a creation of UMNO. Tun Razak sort of realizes that he's losing control of Tun Mustafa. Tun Mustafa just doesn't have the same relationship with him as he had with Tunku Abdul Rahman. That seems to be the case. And they feel that Tun Mustafa is overdoing a number of things. He subtly makes a threat that, hey, I may leave. We may leave the Federation. Tunku Abdul Rahman makes a plea in the New Straits Times saying, please don't do this. Rethink this idea that you want to sort of pull Sabah out. And he also makes a point, actually, you can't pull out. You don't have any avenue to demand a separation. There's no avenue for that legally. And so Berjaya is sort of the creation of UMNO, and they defeat USNO. USNO eventually sort of disappears in the early to mid 1980s. PBS comes along, and again, Berjaya it's a multiracial party. PBS sort of represents one group with a mixture of some others involved. And ever since then, it's just been different philosophies, different demands, different wants. Whilst Berjaya was willing to sacrifice a lot of things, we lost Labuan under Berjaya. We lost our status as an equal partner and became just a mere state under Berjaya. We had a lot of development, interesting ideas and concepts under the leadership of Berjaya. A lot of new JLCs were formed to create jobs, to create investment, to reduce poverty. In hindsight, looking back, there were interesting ideas. There were good ideas, but they were just very poorly managed, very poorly implemented policies, and most of them failed. Kosan is one. Desa had a lot of problems. The list is long. And then PBS comes to power, and again, we have this issue where we suddenly, if you look at Tunku Abdul Rahman, Tun Razak, Hussein On, they're very different in how they go about dealing with leaders that they don't always agree with. They don't use the ISA and arrest you and send you in prison. They will sit down, negotiate, or they just give you a little smack on the hand and say, sorry, no. When Mahathir comes along, everything changes because he does things very differently. And Mahathir does what Mahathir wants. And if you try to challenge him, it just doesn't really go anywhere. There's only going to be one winner, PBS. In the end, you know what happens. By the time you get to sort of the mid-1990s, UMNO comes in, there's a lot of jumping and stuff, and that's really it. It's just been so much of instability for such a long period of time. We've never really had stability in a stable government, except for maybe the Haris years. The Berjaya years, we had a bit of stability for that period of time until he ultimately also gets beaten very badly as well in the elections. So I hope I answered your question. Is it a result of outside influence that we have all this instability? I would say no, it's our own making. Most of it is actually our own making, unfortunately. We Sabahans, we tend to sort of point the fingers at everybody else but ourselves sometimes. It's a lot of the things that have happened actually our own doing. So Syed Kachik sort of opened the door and taught a lot of politicians the art of politics, maybe not in a very positive way, but we just merely continued it. So, and that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, some would see that not more so tragedy, but more of a learning curve for us, considering that Sabah relatively is quite young when it comes to being a united polity or a united entity. I don't think there has been. Maybe you can point to a few
I
instances
would say it's
after,
a
but I don't
tragedy.
think.
I would say it's a
Mm,
tragedy. Let me explain why it's a tragedy. So we've come along this far. We've come along this far from 1963 to where we are to 2024. And everybody that I talk to, and this includes federal officers that have come to Labuan and come to Sabah to work, they all generally make the same comment. How is it that we are so far advanced and you guys are just so far behind that you haven't really advanced in a lot of ways? And it's true, it is a tragedy because we have one of the highest poverty rates in Malaysia. We have one of the highest number of graduates who cannot get employment in Malaysia. And I use Labuan as a Labuan Island. Okay, it's not a part of Sabah anymore. I like to think it is still a part of Sabah, and I would like it to be returned to Sabah if it can be done in a very uh, because I speak of Labuan very positively. Labuan has the highest of adults. Labuan Island. I'm talking about oil and gas people. I'm not talking about people from the outside. Islanders themselves in Labuan. We have the highest number of unemployed amongst locals on the island of Labuan. So have we really improved a lot? Have we really done as well as we should have? Oh, no, we haven't. Could we have done better? Oh, definitely yes. But like I said, you can't blame everything on the federal government. I don't subscribe to blaming the federal government. There are good people in the federal government with very good intentions who have been trying. They've been trying their best and they're trying to fulfill their obligations and responsibilities. And sometimes we ourselves have let ourselves down as well on our side. So.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to say that maybe in a way there's a lot for us to learn here as we grow as a state, or even cultivating our own statehood or identity. So on that note, After, can we make this argument here that because Sabah compared to Sarawak has a much younger, so to say, history, that we weren't as resilient when it comes to pushing back against all these interference, or maybe even being resilient to our own groups having our own interests. Like you said, everyone has their own interests, everyone had their own ideas, and there was never really a solidarity front as compared to when the merger happened, or maybe even the merger there were
Yeah.
disagreements. So could you attribute it to
We're
something like
talking
that, like
we're talking about the period now, or we're talking about the past?
in the past, like when you mentioned how when we were in a way the fight still squabbling amongst each other at the time with all the other political
Well,
parties.
when Donald Stevens makes this 180-degree turn, and he makes a 180, right? He's saying in the beginning, 61 is like, no, 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 we're not in favor of this. We may think about it in the future, but not now. We want independence for ourselves first. We may consider it later. We may consider joining Malaysia, but not now. And he makes a complete 180, not too long after that. He comes back from, okay, so he goes to Singapore. Okay, he goes to Singapore for a conference, colonial conference. He doesn't take any other politician with him. He takes two administrators with him. We know the names of them, the two gentlemen that went with him. Nobody else goes. He doesn't bring anybody from the Chinese SCH, Sabah Chinese Association. He doesn't bring anybody from PASOK. He doesn't bring anybody from USNO. He goes himself. Lee Kuan Yew works on him. He then, I think, convinces Donald that it's in your favor, it's in your best interest to merge and join. He's then invited immediately to Kuala Lumpur. Tunku Rahman again also does the same thing. The Charm Offensive. Look, it's in your best interest to merge, to join. Look at Kuala Lumpur. Look at what we have. Did you see Singapore? Did you see how vibrant the economy is? Look at Sabah. What do you have? How vibrant is your economy? So Donald may have been convinced. He came back with sort of this idea that, okay, maybe this can work. They've promised me development funding. We're going to improve Sabah. We're going to do a lot. We're going to boost the economy. And the only people that can do this are experienced people, which is Malaya and probably Singapore. So why not? It makes sense. And he aligns himself with Tun Mustafa, who had already sort of made up his mind that yes, this is a good idea. So once they made this decision, I think there was very little resistance. But again, the one group that's sort of saying no, this is a really bad idea. This is really not going to work. It's Sundang, and everybody else had aligned. The Chinese were caught by surprise when Donald Stevens came back from this particular conference and announced we are going to join, we're going to merge and stuff. Even the Chinese politicians who are all the Taukes, okay, the Chinese politicians we had no Chinese politicians. They were all Chinese businessmen and Taukes from the East Coast. So two political parties, one representing the Chinese on the West Coast, all the Taukes on the West Coast, Jesselton, and all the Taukes in Sandakan who were all timber tycoons. And even they were caught by surprise. What is this? You didn't discuss with us first. And they eventually had to go along with it because, well, what can we do? How are we going to argue this? How are we going to fight against this? They've all decided. Mustafa's decided. Stevens has decided. It's only really Sundang that's against it, but he doesn't really have as much wealth or power or say. It's really Mustafa and Stevens that are running the Sabah Alliance. So, okay, what to do? Maybe it is a good idea. But the Chinese are the ones that push for the protections, the 20 points and the 40 pence. It's Chinese. We know that. It's the Chinese that actually push for that, the protections. When I spoke to Thomas Jayasuriya a few years ago, he was adamant the Chinese were the ones that actually pushed for the protections, and the colonial officers as well were adamant you must have these protections going forward. The British colonial officers were totally against any participation in merger. They wanted Sabah to be independent. Now, whether they had their own interests in mind, I don't know. But they were certainly against it. So, yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay.
So, just from that response, would it be better, like in an alternative timeline, that maybe somehow Sabah and Sarawak maybe join up to make up Mafilindo, let's say, for example, or Greater Philippines or Greater Indonesia or Borneo states with Brunei in it, Kalimantan in it? Would that maybe not Kalimantan, maybe just these three territories? Would that be something we would enjoy today after?
We're talking about today, is it?
Yeah, but if it Tun Verstappen would change his mind. Yeah.
The Philippines almost wanted to join Malaysia. Sort of by August 63, just before we actually formed Malaysia, they actually made a last-ditch attempt to actually say, actually we are interested in also joining this Malaysia. So it could very well have been Singapore, could have been Singapore, North Borneo, Sarawak, Malaya, and the Philippines. But of course, everybody just ignored it because they looked upon it as an attempt to just delay the process of formation of Malaysia. I don't think it would have worked. Now, if I go back in time and look, Sukarno, if you look at the sort of person Sukarno was, mid-50s, going into the 60s, and this guy was, had, I think, gone off the rails a little bit. Incredibly intelligent person. Sukarno was a very well-read person, but his political philosophies were all over the place. There were a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of fascism, a little bit of socialism and communism and so forth. So getting involved with him back then would never have worked. And as we saw what happened, we actually had a confrontation along the borders of Sarawak and Sabah. The Philippines was actually not interested in making any claims over Sabah. None. And we actually have the documents, 1961 into 62. And it's really pressure from newspapers and other politicians that actually pressure the Philippine government into making a claim over Sabah. The foreign minister, who's a lawyer, and the president, I can never pronounce the name, Marka Pagal, had both agreed that there's no claim. They looked at the documents and said, there's no claim. What are we going to be claiming for? But anyways, if we were to talk about today, I think we already have that sort of. I can't remember the name of this entity that they have where we have some sort of economic relationship with the Philippines and Indonesia and Brunei.
Bimiaga.
I think so, yeah. So we have something like that. It's an interesting concept. I think it's a very smart idea. whoever introduced it, and it is the way to go forward. But as far as merging and so forth, I don't think that will ever happen. I think everybody's got their own interest in mind. But I think if we're going to have any sort of relationship, it would be probably through that. There is a lot we can do together, work together. We know what's going to happen in Kalimantan in the near future once the Indonesian government gets their act together there and gets things rolling there. We haven't looked at one region at all very much. We haven't talked about one region in the greater scheme of things. It's Sulawesi. It's relatively untouched. We're looking at Kalimantan, but it's Sulawesi that's really where I think we also need to pay attention to. But Bruneians are very happy where they are. They don't want to get involved in anybody else's external politics. They don't want to be disturbed. I think the Philippines has its own problems with poverty, overpopulation, and dealing with China. And I think the way to go is through this particular entity that's been formed. Was it BI? What do you call it?
BIM.
Yeah, I think that's really the most realistic way forward, I think, for all of us to collaborate economically. Yeah.
Okay, just to maybe wrap things up.
Yeah.
So to put everything back into context, because you mentioned how Lee Kuan Yew was one of the main drivers and proponents for this formation, right? But we already saw in 2 years after the formation, Singapore was kicked out the federation, and all those aspirations that Singapore had just went out the window essentially, and they were forced to be on their own. And in a way, Sabah also was coaxed into it because of Singapore. So would you say that that was a bit of an awkward moment in history for us in Sabah? That like you said, Tun Fuad went to Singapore, was convinced by Lee Kuan Yew to say, hey, let's join. And in the end, Singapore was ejected.
Let me give you a very simple layman's example. The three of us decide to form a company, all right? And we both have this idea, we're going to start this company and it's going to do really, really well. And I convince you, Adi, that I need you to come in. I need you to be a part of this, and I cannot do it without you. All right. And I tell you, hey, don't worry, I will handle everything. You don't have to worry. I'll make sure that we are profitable and that we are a successful entity. Don't worry. I know this business from A to Z. And I may convince you to invest in it. After 2 or 3 years, I decide I'm going to leave. I'm very sorry, Adi, I've got other priorities and so forth. I'm going to leave. So I'm going to leave the both of you to run this company with all its debts and all its commitments and so forth. How would you feel? I think you'll be disappointed as well. And that's how I sort of look at it upon that sort of thing. There's a letter which I think you may have read, where Donald Stevens writes a letter at night to Lee Kuan Yew, who he considers to be a good friend, and he feels let down and disappointed and so forth. But that Singapore has left, it was never discussed with him, and Lee Kuan Yew never reached out to discuss with him what was going on. But I think the greater scheme of things with this is that Lee Kuan Yew was not obligated to discuss what was going on with Malaya, with Donald Stevens. Donald Stevens also misunderstood his role in the whole federation, even though as an equal partner. Nowhere does it state that the Prime Minister of Malaysia has to discuss anything with the other partners. He does not answerable to them if the cabinet makes a decision and the parliament makes a decision to remove a member from that particular group. And I think Donald Stevens and everybody had a right to be upset because they had been promised this was going to be the grand plan. This was going to be the grand design. This was going to be a successful project. It didn't last very long for a number of reasons. Should we be disappointed? Things should have been different? Yeah, it could have been different. Could have been handled very differently. But in the end, Tunku admits in his last autobiography that he had already made up his mind significantly earlier, months earlier, before he was sick in London, when he made the call to remove Singapore from the Federation. He had already made the decision much, much earlier in the year. So, did I answer your question?
After
Yes.
just a little bit, because we
Sure.
are approaching 1 hour here.
Worries.
So to just use your analogy just now, Adi, you bring in Adi as an investor.
Yeah.
You promise him a lot.
Yeah.
and I would be the Malaya then, because something that you don't mention in the analogy is that Malaya kicked out Singapore.
Yeah.
You did not want to leave, so
Yeah, you could change
Lee
it.
Kuan Yew crying his
You could change
eyes
it.
out.
You could change the narrative, and you could tell Adi, hey, sorry, I don't like Avtar the way he does things. I don't like the way he conducts himself. You know, I'm going to call for an EGM. I'm going to vote, and we're going to me and the company secretary, everybody going to vote to remove him. All right, without telling Adi. Or maybe
All
Adi,
right, so
so Adi turns up and he's surprised what's going on, so it's a 2-1 vote or whatever, or 3-1 vote. I'm removed. So that's left you and Adi there, and you're both looking at each other. Okay, fine. So who's going to run the company now, So,
all right, so
I know-
exactly. Before that, Adi, so my question is that how can Sabahan, because you mentioned like don't blame entirely on the federal government. It's not right. It's also on our Sabahan leaders that do some of the faults. But clearly, the environment was created to accommodate just one particular side, which is the Malaya. Everything. Now I'm gonna suck Adi dry with all the investment that he bring in. I'm just gonna. That's exactly what happened. So how could Sabahan be looking at Malaya in a positive way?
I would say that, okay, this one's a complicated one. Okay, let me put it in context like this. You have to work together. All right. You can't just, they call you on your phone and you hang up on them. They call you again and you hang up with them. You can't have that kind of relationship. At the end of the day, everybody needs to collaborate. There is a system. So when I went to Malaya and I was involved, Malaya, when I went to Putrajaya during 2017, and we were haggling over the new duty-free rules they were going to introduce without discussing with anybody in Labuan, which we knew in hindsight, this is going to kill our duty free in Labuan forever if they do this, and they went ahead with it. And we sat in front of federal officers who listened to us for all of 5 minutes. And in the end, the question they asked us, but why do you need duty free? Why can't you do other businesses? That was the answer. It was a genuine answer. Why can't you do other business? Why must you do duty free? Why are you so hard up on duty free? And then I sort of realized we're not only dealing with human beings, we're dealing with a machine. This machine only knows how to operate in one direction, and that's forward. Their role is to administer. Their role is to generate revenue, and their role is to ensure that Malaysia moves forward. Everything else that goes on alongside that or in it or outside of it, it's not their purview. It's the politicians that decide. So as much as we want to blame the federal government, they have their own way of thinking, their own way of looking at the world, and it is not necessarily always aligned with how we see the world. So you have two choices. You can go up against them and you probably won't win. Or two, you try to find common ground. Try to negotiate and say, okay, guys, look, we have this agreement. This is what's being done. This isn't what is being done. Can we please try to find common ground and try to get things back on track, which I think is being done now. We have a prime minister, and we've had a prime minister before him that were finally willing to listen and willing to try to make things right, which weren't right under previous prime ministers and administrations. They are trying, but it's not easy. And trying to get people, in any negotiation, I think, Adi, you'll also probably agree with me as well. Any negotiation where you have two sides that don't agree on something, finding common ground is not the easiest thing to do. And so you negotiate and you try your very, very best to find common ground where both sides can agree to it. And that's not always easy, and it doesn't always work. You're not always successful in that. Whilst we like to think just because you put two people in a room, they can negotiate, they will come out with a solution that pleases everybody. That's not the real world. It's not always the case, as I've discovered. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think being the Sabah in this allegory, I don't blame you for anything, Haffiz. I think there's a great dynamic that we have here. That aside, just as a closing remark, After, when you see the Malaysia that was, aspired to by the founding fathers and the founding leaders, do you think, as a closing remark, we've matched up to those aspirations? And if not, are we at least getting somewhere? Because you did mention that this Prime Minister and the past Prime Minister have been amenable to Sabah and Sarawak. What more do you think we can do?
I think whatever we're going to do, we really, really need to do it now and not drag it. And I think there is a great danger if you allow it to be dragged. Again, earlier when there's one thing I always remind myself is you will never always get everything you want when you're trying to negotiate for something that the other side doesn't want to give. And this is really what has happened. We've signed an agreement, and I'm being very honest here, and I hope nobody gets offended with what I have to say, but we signed an agreement with various entities. Everybody agreed to honor it. We all know that for many reasons, I'm not going to blame one person or several. It's for many reasons, those promises in the agreement were not honored. I think they realize it now. Okay, fine, it was not honored. Let's put things back on track. But I would say, realistically, we're not going to solve the 40%. And that's really the gist of it, right? Well, that's what we're really, really talking. Everything else is going to come back. It's the 40% because it's so vague. And I would suggest the only way forward is to sit down and renegotiate that aspect or to rewrite a new agreement, taking the majority of what was in the original one and making things as clear and as transparent as possible that there's no more discussion and confusion on it. And it also doesn't help when one side doesn't want to release documents to you and you've asked, I don't know, I'm basing it on what I've read in newspapers 8 times and they don't want to give it to you. Okay, that's not good. That doesn't tell you that there's good intentions and you're not actually trying to find a solution. And I would suggest don't do that. Be honest, be transparent, and just tell the truth. Like, look, we owe you this amount. We can't pay you that amount. You know we can't pay you that amount. If we were to pay you the amount that we're supposed to pay you, it's going to cause problems for the economy. Let's be sensible. Let's work out a payment plan. Let's pay you in installments, or let's give you seats on various boards. Let's return certain lands to Sabah. I'm just throwing an example. Felda, we'll give you all the Felda lands back. You get Yayasan Sabah to manage it. Yayasan Sabah will appoint Sabahans to manage it and so forth. Build. And you brought up a good point in your interview at BFM. How can we find ways of raising revenue from within existing rules and regulations? Give back our land, some of the Felda lands and so forth. Don't get offended, anybody in Felda. It's just an idea. And let us raise revenue from there, for example, palm oil lands and so forth. But at the end of the day, if one side doesn't want to cooperate by releasing documents and you are adamant, we must find a solution to this and you're not getting anywhere, then what does it tell you? I think there is sincerity. I think there is sincerity and there is a want. But we need the Sarawakians more than anything because the Sarawakians are playing this game and they're playing it very, very well. And we can only learn from how they're playing it because we're so divided here. You know this, we're so divided. We have so much of external influence within the Sabah political scene. But I still believe they are good people, willing to negotiate and find solutions. But we have to go with a very common sense solution to this, because we're not going to get anywhere otherwise.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we need to sit down and talk more with each other. Communication is always key when you find anything out. That seems to be what the founding fathers did. They just talked and talked until they finally came to a consensus. So why not?
The thing is, when you read the diplomatic documents about when the Australians are looking at Donald Stevens, they're like, okay, so who's the guy that we can sit down and talk to them the easiest? And everything always points at Donald Stevens. Also, Mustafa can't speak very well in English. He doesn't have the same sort of ability to talk. He's very diplomatic. He's very he's an entertainer. He's a joker. They feel very comfortable with an environment with him, discussing, negotiating with him. So, these things make a big difference sometimes. These little things. Not everybody is made that way. Not everybody has that charisma that Donald Stevens had, for example. Mustafa is special in his own way. Tunku Abdul Rahman's relationship is not actually, his close relationship is not with Donald Stevens as many people would think. It's actually with Tun Mustafa. Until his death, the one person that Tunku Abdul Rahman talks about, the man that came to help him when he was going through a very difficult time in life, was Tun Mustafa. and it happened out of the blue. He repaid an old friend that needed help. So that sort of tells you the attributes of Tun Mustafa, the sort of man he was. But like I said, nobody's perfect. But everybody looked at Donald Stevens as the man to make a decision for the future of Sabah at that particular period of time.
I see. So I think in a way there's a lot to unravel with the characters that were involved. So maybe next time we can look granularly more into all these characters, all these basically chess pieces on the board in the future. But I think that's all the time we have today on our special on Malaysia Day, where we delve into like the events leading up to the Malaysian agreement and the formation of Malaysia and what came after, some of the political machinations that happened behind the scenes, for good or for ill. That's up to you. And we're very happy to have Avtar again once on the podcast. And if you are interested in this kind of content and Avtar as our guest, please do support him on his YouTube channel, Avtar Singh History. So it's a very great place of research and content that you can learn regarding anything about Sabah and Malaysia's history. So aside from me, Haffiz, you have anything else to say?
Yeah, and also help us our channel also Kopitiam Council by commenting, liking, and share this video if you think that this is a video that every Malaysian should listen to on this auspicious day. Selamat Hari Malaysia. So with that,
yeah, I think for everyone here, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. We've almost reached our goal of hitting 1,000 subscribers.
Hey, yes.
Very much appreciate any and all support. So with that said, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you again, Avtar, for being here tonight.